Hello and welcome to a new season of the AIGA Design Podcast. My name is Lishan Huang, Senior Director of Learning and Programs here at AIGA, the Professional Association for Design.
And I am Julia Donatello. I am the Competitions and Event Manager at AIGA.
This season, we are exploring the theme of design and performance with all of the different possible nuances of that term of performance. And our very first guests for this season are Scott Doorley and Carissa Carter from the Stanford D.school. They are also the co-authors of this new book, Assembling Tomorrow. So we're going to talk about who they are, what they do as educators, and as we'll dive into some highlights from the book as well. But over to you, Julia, to kick things off.
So as we kickstart this, I was wondering, what was the inspiration to write this book, and how did the first ideas come up to you both?
Well, I think the backdrop for writing this book is how unsettling the world is right now. To all of us, Scott and I feel it. I'm sure you two can resonate with that in some way, but in many ways, our climate is on the fritz, and in particular, technologies and the technologies that we build with as designers are changing really quickly and in a way that they are what we call mischievous and on their own. Right. So the tech that we are now including in our design materials, like AI, like synthetic biology or artificial evolution, we call it, right? Like when you're building with algorithms and genetic code, those things change and make decisions after you launch them and change their logic after they're released into the wild. And that's part of the backdrop with which we, had the motivation to craft this book, because it was super throwing us off kilter in our design work, and we saw it in our students. And so even though we felt this way, we also know how much agency each one of us has to craft a really wonderful tomorrow. And we knew from our experience in classrooms about building activities to help students see this world in new ways and to create with responsibility and humility. Like we wanted to turn that into a book, and that was a bit of the backdrop that led to us writing Assembling Tomorrow.
Before we dive deeper into the book, I'd love to hear, I think our audience members who are maybe not as familiar with the Stanford D.school would love to hear a little bit about your institution and maybe a bit about what you teach as well.
Yeah, the D.school is in the School of Engineering. We're actually in the Institute at Stanford, which means that we sit in one of the schools rather than inside a department. And that allows us to work with students from around the university. So every year we work with more than 1,000 Stanford students. And then we do a lot of work outside Stanford as well. And we look at design in a few different ways. Our program started with product design, which in other programs was called the industrial design. Mm-hmm. And there's like a fundamental difference at that time. This is like in the 60s. At that time in that approach, and the approach, what they came up with was called comprehensive design. So this is around the late 60s or early 70s. And it's a way of looking at design where you're looking at all the layers of interaction. Carissa uses an incredible framework that, design is not just about the products we create, but it's the experiences that creates and the systems that lives in, and the implications and the data that drives it. So we push students to really look at, the holistic space of design. And now we also have 2 degree programs, one for undergrad and one for grad students.
Very cool. So jumping now into topics of the book. So I'm curious if you can elaborate on your perception of the term runaway design. And what do you think is our role as designers to engage with this more responsibly?
Yeah, the term runaway design is the backdrop for the moment that we're in, right? And it's a bit of what I was saying before about how our materials seem to be getting away from us in a way. And one other layer to add to that is like the things that we make with, right? Like if they are tangible things, like I've got a piece of paper here, and when you fold it, like I get it. I know that it's folded, right? And we all have a sense that like I could fold this into a paper airplane and it would fly. I understand what the paper affords me to do. And like in other physical materials like wood like metal, etc. Like I might not be a master crafts person, but I kind of can understand how, you might joint the wood together to make a structure that could support a certain amount of weight. And I can also see if that structure has failed or if it's wobbling, etc. Right? But in this runaway design world where those algorithms, genetic code, etc., like the stuff that we're building with is now invisible, and we don't have a sense as makers as to what those materials really afford, like that's what makes it a bit of a runaway design moment. Right? They're changing fast, they're scaling fast, and we don't actually know when they go wrong until we see how they've crashed or they've tumbled or that structure has crumbled.
And that's an interesting point, like using the piece of paper, right? Because it's like, okay, that's like a finite thing we can hold in our hand. But even the piece of paper, it's like, okay, well, where did it come from in terms of like the trees and the supply chain? But then if we apply it to something like AI, right, it's like it's running on some server somewhere we don't know. And then, what kind of energy is being used to power that, plus like, whatever the social effects are of whatever AI application as well. So it's like all of the stuff that's like beneath the surface of the water, if we're using like an iceberg as a metaphor.
Yeah, I mean, it's that you're exactly right, Lishan. It's that interconnectedness of design work, right? And then the minute that you start to peel back those layers, Scott was talking about products, experiences, systems, and then the tech and the data that power that and the implications of all of it. Like when you were talking about that, if you take this piece of paper, right, like this is a product, it like allows me the experience of writing and folding and paper airplane making, right, and even mailing letters, etc. Like there's many systems that control its distribution and production, like you were just saying, and there's the technologies that go into creating it and making it this bleached white color, right? And then there's the data that even powers like what size it should be, right? And like how it comes like in reams to us, right? And like there's all these different implications for that, and the sizing that we use in this country versus other countries, and who can use this medium, who might be excluded from it. And that's what's really part of what makes it a runaway design moment, is because like that interconnection, once you start to like realize it's everywhere, and you realize that how some of our technologies really allow that to take off really quickly today and in ways we can't really control. Sorry, Scott, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, to build on that last point, the job sometimes of technology is to sort of transcend our limits, right? And you see every time a new technology comes out, it's like, it's going beyond what we were used to. It's creating this new paradigm and we have to move into. I think the job of design is then to choose new limits. It's, like design's all about constraints. How are we making decisions about what we feel like this should be used for, and what's going to be desirable to put in front of people, and what do we care about, and how should that be built into the way it gets disposed of, let alone the way it gets created? And so design, I think, it has a really important role in adding constraints, meaningful constraints, back into these sort of breaking of past limits.
I wanted to circle back on some of the themes of the book in a little bit, but I wanted to share about like the structure as well. So for folks who have not read the book yet, it's a combination of nonfiction and fiction, right? So there's like the main narrative, if you will, where you're looking at different phenomena, different trends, making sense of it, citing other folks who are studying this stuff, looking at it. But then you have these like vignettes that are sprinkled throughout the book. I felt like they were like postcards from different futures. My favorite one, one of the earliest ones in the book, is the AI mother who had passed away. And it's really about like, we already see beginnings of stuff like this with chatbots and people who've like tried to memorialize their dead relatives and friends through large language models and stuff like that. But it really explored like this like relationship between two sisters. Why did you choose to do this like fiction, nonfiction structure?
At a baseline, right, all design begins as fiction. So everything is imagined before it is created. And so if we're writing a book about assembling tomorrow, part of our job then is to imagine some possible futures and try them on before we commit to any one. And that's what each of those speculative fiction stories is about, is testing and see if we like how we look in those futures. they're also like really fun ways to explore specific moments in the future that you can't just get from talking about what technology might do, like from that posture. That
Totally.
story that you were referring to, Lishan, was one that Scott wrote. I love it too. It's called Sibling Rivalry. And yeah, so these siblings are arguing over which version of their dead mother to bring back. And I'll also say, like we wrote this book before that those services that currently exist that do that existed. Like it felt far more futuristic at the time, and like that's Runaway Design, right? Like the fact that now you have at least 4 or 5 choices for how to bring back a deceased relative is pretty remarkable, right? And you do need to ask yourself, like, what do we want? Like, what would we want out of bringing somebody like that back? That feels like really big questions that we should be asking now. It taps at our emotions, it taps at relationships, it taps at a lot more beyond just what the tech can do.
Maybe one each, another story that you would want to give us a preview of?
Just building on what Chris was saying, and I know you teach future-looking classes too, Lishan, and it feels like if we don't think a few steps ahead, we're actually sort of a little bit behind, particularly because these things are coming to fruition so quickly. We had 3 or 4 stories that, we thought were plausible, but when we started writing them in 2021, they weren't happening. And by the time the book was published, they literally were, services you can pay for. One of the stories in there is about a guy who's trying to reconnect with people in his life. And so he has this sort of embedded AI that's helping him have conversations with people. It's like encouraging him to call people. He calls like sort of an ex-girlfriend, and it's guiding him through the conversation. It doesn't go well, but I had a student who literally created a prototype of that product 2 years after I had him as a student, about at the same time as I wrote the story, with neither of us knowing that was happening, And so it's just kind of amazing how fast things are moving. Another one I'll just throw in there that Carissa wrote is called Compassion School. And there are a couple in the book that are really sort of forward-looking to say, like, what do we value in the world? And Compassion School looks at the idea that what if we created leaders based on their capacity for compassion? What if compassion, say, was, a criteria you were really looking for in an elected leader, or in someone who, might even be able to go through an educational process? How would we dictate that? Where would we find them? And there's something about being able to not just come up with that idea, but explore, like, what would be the mechanics of that? And how would that feel? And what things would that create that are maybe like a little less desirable? What kind of problems would it cause? And the storytelling actually just like allows you to play with those details. What comes after? And it's really, really rich activity, let alone, hopefully it also, is something to ponder as you read the book.
Yeah, I assigned your book to my class for the first time this semester. We were talking about it before we started rolling, but I teach a class on designing the future. It's an executive master's program at Parsons. And the students are working professionals. They're mostly in their mid-30s, as is the average age. And so a lot of them are already leaders. They're working on different products, services, different kind of things. And, often in these corporate environments where they're working, it's all about like, okay, what is the next product launch, right? The next version that they're launching of whatever. And so I think grad school and this class is a good way for them to reflect on both like a longer time horizon, which your book does as well, right? Thinking about through the lens of all design is future making, but also like just a larger systems perspective of like, okay, you are responsible for whatever it is you're putting in the world. Like, what are the ripple effects? Can you maybe tell a story to try to understand the potential systemic impacts of what you're doing? And then, yeah, also I got my students to write their own future stories as well.
Yes.
Because it's also a
I
way to
did
like just
too.
deal with like again, that short-termism, right? Or like just the next version and the next design sprint, that stuff that they have plenty of time for. So grad school is like the perfect space to like think about that. So they either do like a personal future, like where do they see themselves like a decade in the future, or they have their own independent study projects. Essentially, they're like their master's theses. And so sometimes they also have the option to to do that, right? It's like, okay, you've already launched your thesis as a thing in the world. Like, what does it look like when you've reached scale? And so it's a way to integrate that into the other things they're doing.
And that's incredible. Did any interesting facets come out in any of those stories this year that are shareable? I'm just eager to know what types of things students latch onto.
I think there's a lot of interest, like inspired by your book with like, and the orca story, which I won't spoil because it's so good. But folks were really exploring like the relationship with nature. So I have a graduate student who's working on, she uses like sake, like the Japanese rice wine, as a way to help groups with like self-discovery. So bringing in like the history and the production of sake for these kind of facilitated things. And so she was doing some stuff on like the future of this and of facilitation and like that connection with nature as part of this process. Had another student who was looking at essentially like trying to find like a creative type. And so like, how do we find like a happy balance between like, okay, being sorted in this way that is optimized for, flourishing and good for organizations and teams without going full on like, what is that sci-fi, young adult sci-fi series like Divergent, that series, or like Gattaca or these kind of like almost like, eugenics type things, right? Where it becomes too rigid and people get too pigeonholed. So I think another prompt that I give my students is to like think about that in between space between like a utopian and dystopian future, because that's where like a lot of the interesting explorations are.
Yeah, no, I love that, right? And I think you're right, that in between utopia, dystopia, like that's where we're gonna be. There's no absolute, right? And like wrestling with, even when you put your best ideas forward, the best of intentions, it's going to affect something. It's going to displace somebody. It's going to take over a job, right? Like things will go wrong for someone somewhere in the ecosystem, and the fiction's such a great way to experiment with that.
Yeah, and fiction writing sometimes seems very whimsical. But as you're pointing out, Lishan, it's when you get into it, it actually becomes a kind of safe way to explore some things that if you were just thinking about it in terms of like product repercussions after your release, wouldn't feel, you wouldn't really be able to explore. You would kind of just get caught in like, well, what's the cascading impact there? But when you get into the fiction world, you can kind of play with it a little bit, and allows you to open your mind to things that, might be on the horizon for whatever you're doing, but you don't want to think about.
Totally. Yeah, there's another point that I think helped a lot. It's something that I've learned in the last couple of years. I've been studying comedy writing and improv. I hadn't really done much fiction at all before this. And one tip that I think was helpful for my students was like getting them to make like one leap, right? That could be like a sci-fi choice, like with your story, Scott, with the mother who's like preserved as this AI. But then everything else should be like grounded around that, right? So even though we do have some services that are doing something like that now, but in this farther off future, like the relationship between the two siblings is very grounded in human feelings. And so by having making that one jump and then trying to like see like how do you make it as realistic as possible after that is another way to kind of keep it grounded in that way.
Yeah, even as things change, so many things persist. And so we have a tendency of, I think what you're saying is we have a tendency of writing these stories where like everything's changed and it's all new. And you sometimes get into then that trap of like utopia, dystopia, right?
Yeah.
And it's a mixtopia, it's a messytopia or whatever. It's just a mess. And that's because the things that we've been doing don't go away immediately. We're still driving cars. Those were invented over 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Even at a mass scale.
Yeah. Or there's like science fiction, like the Jetsons, right? This cartoon I grew up with where like they have flying cars, but then like they still have to be driven, or like, the wife is still taking like cash money to go to the mall, right? So there's like all of these 1960s like sexist stereotypes. So it's like things have changed, but then nothing has changed socially, which, is also something to avoid on that extreme.
I mean, I think that brings up like a really key point, which is like, we're changing things, but what do we actually want to change? And that kind of gets into that story with the two sisters. Like they're trying to solve basically like a family issue around how they live with each other, how they interact as a family. and they think, resurrecting mom's going to solve this problem, but the problem's still there, right? So like, I feel like a lot of times we're basically creating solutions that are in need of a problem, or we're just ignoring problems that are in need of a solution. And so like really just thinking about like, what is the change that we want? What would this technology give us that might be useful or not?
I'm curious also to hear a little bit from your personal take on how you are approaching your creative process and usage of technology and AI support. So I've seen myself now at times either, tired or wanting some refreshing, going to some type of AI support tool. And then I'm always questioning myself, shouldn't I be doing this? Like what is the relationship that you personally are building and creating with these tools?
It's a great question. I think it's, at least for me personally, it's an ever-evolving one too. It's one that I have a couple graduate students wrestling with in their year-long projects right now. We have a group that is meeting weekly right now that talks only about creativity in the age of AI and like pushing the limits of that in multiple different dimensions. So I know that this is one that's like actively being explored by people from all angles. And I find myself like constantly like, oh, wait, you do that with it? Oh, wait, you do, for myself, I sometimes use AI. And when I do, it is often because I want to kind of like experiment with what it might be able to do. I don't think I've worked it into my workflow yet, and I think I probably will at some point soon. That feels like it's coming, but there's a hurdle to embracing something into your process, etc. And I just, I haven't crossed that limit myself. I probably have spent most of my AI time trying to deconstruct it and make it analog so that other people can learn and understand it out of AI platforms. So, like making like tools you can hold in your hand to say, if I use this type of machine learning algorithm and this type of data set, I might do or create what, right? So that a big part of my work is trying to give some visibility to the invisibility of what it's doing so that people can feel empowered in using it and talking about all the things we don't know about it, and that even the most sophisticated technologist doesn't know about it. Because that's, it's critical that we talk about the uncertainty and the, lack of transparency in AI's decision making.
Yeah, I have the sort of mixed feeling about it too. Like on the one hand, I think there's a lot of issues with it just around like creative job replacement, that just make me really uncomfortable, not to mention the fact that it is built off the creativity of people to get there, right? So that like really, really bothers me. The like utility of it, I think I've been kind of coming around to via seeing other people use it a little bit. So I've seen a lot of examples where people are doing something that actually just like couldn't have been done without it. So one example is the end papers of our book were created by a guy named Aaron Huey with the help of AI, who's a National Geographic photographer. He took pictures of climate change in action over a decade. So wildfires, glacial melt, oil spills. And then he put those into an AI and had them create wallpaper patterns. And there's something magical about what came out there. Then he has a site where you can download those wallpaper patterns and you can wallpaper your walls with it. They're beautiful patterns, but they're based on these disasters, floods, and so it's a way to kind of call attention to climate change using AI to do something that really kind of couldn't have been done without it. I mean, I suppose it could have been, but it felt like very kind of original to the tool. And that kind of stuff like really interests me, and it's really kind of exciting. And, so it's very, very mixed feelings,
Yeah, in my own stuff, I've kind of used it on the edges, either like at the beginning and or the end of a writing process. So the beginning is like, okay, well, help me ideate, or I'll use it of like, okay, I've already written this thing. Do you have like feedback or punch ups on ways to like rework the sentence or this headline or whatever? I did have something really funny happen to me because of AI recently, where somebody else, like this woman in the UK, she used ChatGPT or whatever it was, but the AI hallucinated that I had written a book that I did not write.
Oh.
And so she actually emailed me and the publisher of this supposed book and like asked about it. And I was like, actually, that's a
Wow.
cool topic, but I did not write this book. And
Yeah.
so it's like, okay, whatever large language model this was, it was like, okay, it knows that I'm a real person. And like, it was like expertise definitely kind of like adjacent to my wheelhouse, but then somehow connected it with like a book that doesn't exist with a real publisher, you know?
Yeah, no,
amazing.
that's cool. Yeah, another fun example. This is one of our graduate students, Veronica Chen, is working on like really exploring this crossover between AI and creativity, and she's not sure where she lands on it yet. And that's part of the really interesting exploration. And she and two other students, Ko Tarai and Kalina Yang, have over the weekend acquired a pumpkin that is large enough that it needs a forklift, so you
I
can
was
just get a sense.
talking to Ko
Wow.
today.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my
and
God.
and they've used AI with the actual geometry of that pumpkin to give them a design for how it should be carved. And like there's some really interesting aspects that it has, like, and now they're gonna carve that for real as humans, right? And like
Yeah, yeah.
so there is something interesting with that back and forth collaboration with something that is so like an AI cannot carve a pumpkin. Right. But it can suggest, and like how well that's going to do, like I just can't wait to see it. And it's also just like a glorious, just like object of this season and this moment. And I feel like these places where AI like reminds us that we are really human, I love too. And like this one example of it.
Right. It's like finding that kind of hybrid cyborg space,
Mhm.
you know, just
Yeah.
as like
Yeah.
with these future scenarios, you're trying to find like that space in between the utopia and the dystopia, but it's like not fully human, not fully machine, but like what is that in between is like such
Yeah.
a rich area for exploration.
Yeah, which we
and I
already
think
may be mixes, right?
Yeah.
Where are you going to go
Yeah.
there, Scott?
I actually wasn't, but do you want to keep going on that?
Well, I'll
before I-
just say like this human/machine, like I'm already a little machine with these glasses on, right?
Totally.
Like I'm already a little machine if I've had a knee surgery and there's a plastic part inside of me, you know, and so how like getting comfortable with that different kind of crossover is fascinating.
Yeah, and I was going to add that it feels like these weird scenarios that are not, I don't know if weird's the right word, but that idea that like, you know, you're getting it to kind of, you're almost becoming subservient to it on the pumpkin carving, but you have to do the work and it can't do the thing if you don't put it in, you know, this sort of like odd role that it plays is actually like way more interesting and exciting than like, you know, it's like a really good autocorrect editor, you know, that can help me, you know, like it's a much more interesting use case. I think it's fascinating.
So I wanted to talk about being awkward. You have an entire chapter on that in your book. We recently had our AIGA design conference this year, and there was a workshop on like neurodiversity, and it was like one of the most highly attended things at our conference. So I think designers are probably overrepresented. People who are neurodiverse, as well as people in the kind of LGBTQ spaces, are also overrepresented in design kind of cultures and teams, maybe compared to the general population. And often, you know, these are folks who are awkward in that sense of like not fitting into established dominant ways of being and living in the world. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on like why you chose awkwardness as something to put in the book and to really like promote or get designers to embrace.
Like at its core, awkwardness is something that you literally feel inside of you when there's a gap between your expectation of a moment or a situation or a culture and what you're met with. So it's like a way that you actually see a distance between you and whatever the quote unquote norm or expected behavior or, you know, regular flow of a situation is. Right. And design is really about noticing those gaps, right? Our way that we title a lot of the talks that we gave about this book is how to see the unseen. And that's really, you know, awkwardness is in feeling it is one way to notice that something's amiss. And then you can go into like, well, why is that? And is this an opportunity? Like you're saying the neurodivergence, like I feel like that you're spot on there. Like, how are we tapping into people that already see and experience the world differently? There's like wild potential for noticing patterns differently, right? Opportunities, not only like, hey, these people don't fit a norm, but I feel like there's a whole other way. Like those are the people that are going to really see solutions that nobody else could have come up with. So like awkwardness is that first signal. I'll say that. Let Scott build on that.
Yeah, there's opportunity in that awkwardness too. So in that chapter, we talk a lot about gaps, and gaps being sort of like the distance between like what could be to create a different type of situation. I'm a little wary about using the word better, but like what could be to improve a situation and what exists at the moment. And those gaps come of feeling that awkwardness, right? Like if you're not feeling that awkwardness, you're not noticing those gaps. And I think you bring up a really important point there, which is like, if you're outside the norm, I mean, there are a lot of disadvantages to that, but an advantage is that you're just seeing things from a perspective that other people aren't looking. And there's just huge windows of opportunity in being able to see that. So like, I can think as soon as you brought that up about neurodiversity in design, like 3 people came to mind, like right away, like, yep. Yeah. And they are all so good at noticing. And I think it's no mistake that, you have maybe a higher percentage of people identifying as queer in design, and then also differently abled people or people who have differently abled family members are often also inspired to do things because you recognize that awkwardness, you live in that awkwardness, and you're not afraid to say like, hey, maybe there's something beyond this. Whereas a lot of people who might not sort of have to grapple with it in the same way, just kind of pass through it, they avoid it because it's sort of like, well, that's awkward, but maybe I don't have to deal with that. And then you're kind of missing out on a chance to make things better.
The other category, which I see a lot, the design schools where I teach at Parsons, I also teach at SVA, School of Visual Arts, is that the master students are a very high percentage of them are international students, right? And so some of them like come, and Julia was an international student from Brazil. And so they're coming into a new culture and like, so that gives them both like what they're bringing from their home culture, but also like noticing things that, I grew up in the US, so I probably just don't notice because it's just like the water that I swim in.
We talk a lot about in the book about untaking things for granted. And I think when you're in a new situation, it's like you don't take things for granted, right? So you're all of a sudden questioning everything. Like, why is that like that? Or that's a weird way of doing that. Whereas a lot of us are just kind of accepting it because we have to move through that culture. Sorry, Carissa.
No, I was going to say something similar. And, when you travel to a different country, it's totally heightened, right? Because you're noticing that to an extreme. But you can also force yourself into that noticing in your own environment, right? If you take a totally different path from your home to, where you walk to the bus stop, like you start like taking things away from your peripheral vision and you tune in a little bit more. And so there's a lot that we can do to practice that noticing, and like to shake us into, we call it like deliberate disorientation, right? Like how do you make yourself be a little bit off kilter in the situation you're in as a way to see facets of it that you wouldn't have noticed otherwise?
Totally. Julia, do you have any examples or stories you want to share, or the next question?
Yeah, I think for me, it's funny because I feel like I haven't lost my Brazilian way of seeing things, but I have to remind myself to adjust, right? So I think a very, very simple and basic everyday reaction for me is like when I meet someone new, I never know if I can hug that person or if I should just say hi. So there's always this awkwardness inside of me because I'm like, okay, let me read this context. And then once I build some relationship with that person, then I already know, right? Because then the expectation somehow is set. But when it's the very first moment, I always feel like, oh, can I hug? Can I not? How does it work? So it's always I'm always reminding myself to wait a little bit and then react. Otherwise, it would be more automatic for me in another context. Yeah.
I had the opposite experience. I had the chance to work in Brazil like just over a decade ago, or like in my career. So I was like the only American in the office because it was like an American agency that opened an office in Rio. Everyone else was Brazilian, and there's one colleague who's from Portugal. It was interesting. Like for me, the first thing was like just the people's relationship to time and the way that meetings were run. And there was like some workshop where like people were just like the introductions took like an hour and a half. And then somebody who was one of the workshop participants we were facilitating was like bicultural, like she was British and Brazilian, but had grown up partly in the US. And she like turned to me, she's like, yeah, people have to feel comfortable first before they can get down to business, right? And it's like, okay, well, I'm going to relax then, because I felt like, oh, was I losing control as a facilitator or whatever? But yeah, it's like that adaptation. But I also noted, I was doing branding work back then, but I was able to like notice things in just the physical environment there and the visual culture that like my Brazilian colleagues like just weren't noticing because they were surrounded by that all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really amazing. And Carissa brought up that like you don't have to travel that far to get there. You just have to be able to get into a state of that sort of, we call it deliberate disorientation. There's our publicist actually worked with a guy who walked every street in either all 5 boroughs of New York or just Manhattan. I can't remember.
Oh, wow.
And he was saying when he talks to people, oftentimes they're so into their routine, they don't know what like the back of their building looks like or the block behind. So like, if I live on 10th, I might not know what 9th looks like because I leave 10th and I go to work up in Midtown or something. And that's just my normal path, or the restaurants are off on the river that way. And so like, there's so much. A friend of ours talks about how whenever he commutes, he takes the same commute, but he tries to notice one different thing on the commute, right? And that it just like awakens you a little bit in the way that like traveling and just showing up somewhere where you can't help but be awakened. But you can do it in your day to day too. And I think designers are particularly good at that, actually.
Yeah, one of my favorite activities in class, and it's in the book, is the theory of the dérive. The dérive, it's a French word which means to drift, and it comes from the psychogeography movement, and from the 60s, right? And so essentially, it is the way that you can practice this is go outside and set your timer for half hour, 1 hour, pick a block of time, no technology otherwise, and follow a color, right? So if there's red over there, I walk over to it and then like wait to see where's that next red in your peripheral vision and walk to that, and where's the next one in your peripheral, and like, so you just like allow yourself to follow something, whether it's a color or a shadow pattern or acceleration or a texture, etc. And with that simple setup, send people out, and then they come back and everybody comes back and they're like, oh my God, like I had no idea. Like the conversations that happen after that, I can't do them justice.
Yeah.
Right. And it's something that any one of us can do. And yet it's like, it takes a little bit of inertia. It takes somebody assigning you to do it. Right. But you see what's right there all along in an entirely different way.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it ties in so much with our theme of performance this season too, right? Just this idea of like, how do we cultivate being a designer, right? So when we go and practice it and doing so, it's like exercises like these that you can do yourself. You don't necessarily have to uproot and move to another country, right? As we were talking about, but just these little things like this dérive exercise you were talking about, or design fictions, future stories in the book, and writing your own, like things like that kind of cultivate ourselves as designers in terms of how like athletes train,
Yeah, and I think the idea of sort of doing it continuously, there's a lot of research around sort of career spikes, and often a career spike comes after some fairly long period of exploration, right? So it might be like taking a new job, taking some time off, doing a project that's like very different, or just exploring something that you haven't explored before. And then you start to consolidate what you've been learning through the exploration, and it becomes like kind of a path to higher performance, if you think about it that way. And the other thing is we often have a tendency to only validate the things that we learn during a project, right? Like, okay, I'm on the project now, I'm going to do a period of research, and then I'm going to go, do my design. When the body of work that you've been doing your whole life, and of course you have to be careful about bias and where you're coming from and know your positionality and point of view, but like that body of work can be valuable at any given moment. So I think like if you think of performance, it's sort of like thinking of it as like an ongoing thing rather than if I do this now, it will lead to higher performance, versus like, well, if I have these habits over time, they're going to add up in ways that are bigger than I can even imagine.
Totally. And I think like on that point of like your body of work, it's like your portfolio is more than just the thing that gets you your next design job, but it's
Mhm.
like just your
Right.
toolkit of things to go back to, right? Even if it's like seemingly a totally different project, but maybe there's something that you can reuse or adapt there.
Yeah, there's like some Picasso thing, and Picasso, I think, was probably not the best ever. He sounds
Yeah.
like a pretty horrible guy, but he like did a sketch and somebody wanted to take it. He did a sketch on a napkin and somebody wanted it. And he was like, no, you can't have that, or I'll pay, give me $20,000. I'll give you my sketch. And they were like, well, you just did it in 30 seconds. He's like, no, it took me 60 years to get to the point where I can make that sketch, in 20 seconds or whatever.
Totally.
There was
real.
another thing that made me think of 10 years ago, Scott and I did this project at the D.school that was like looking at the future of higher education, residential higher education in a world where everything was going MOOCy, the big online classes, MOOCs.
Mhm.
And the thought of like portfolios and jobs and hiring came up, and I'm forgetting who said this, but it became this sentiment that's advice that I still give to students when they're preparing those portfolios, which is around like an employer is not, they may be looking to see the work that you have done, but what they really want to know is like what you have the ability to do in the future, right? And so how you position what you have done, right, in ways that they see that like, oh, this person has been able to mock up illustrations that have flowed beautifully across, these apps, etc.
Totally.
But like that might tie like really interestingly to this new type of technology I'm building where we want to bring in illustration in a new way. Like it's like you don't need a one-to-one correlation, but you have to be able to talk about what you might be able to do, what you could be able to do. That's non-trivial. That's a tricky thing.
Yeah.
It's a tricky thing to do.
Carissa and Scott, it's been great chatting with you about your book, your teaching, your points of view on design. We like to ask all of our guests a closing question, which is, do you have something to recommend that's not your book to our listeners? It could be like another book, it could be a TV show, some piece of media, piece of art, something to recommend to take us out today.
The book that I cannot stop talking about right now is called The Light Eaters. It's by Zoe Schlanger, and it's all about the world of plant intelligence and how plants sense the world. And it has fundamentally shifted how I go about my day and how I look at everything from a blade of grass to a bud of a flower. And I think like it is, as a designer, I'm really now in tune, to sensing and sense making, like always have been, but now from the lens of the plant world, like, wow, I cannot wait to see what happens next. So highly recommend.
Amazing.
And I will give some books and media to support this in case people are interested in, but I have to say like a fruitful thing for me lately has just been like getting into architecture and trying to understand like, what is somebody trying to say with the thing that they make? So I think what I was going to say is like, don't even read about that. Just go out and like look at stuff and like, what is this telling us about what the person cared about when they made this? I think it's just like a really fruitful activity, especially from a design standpoint. And architecture is everywhere and it's so rich. I will say like a great book that gets into that is David Byrne has this it's sort of not really memoir. It's kind of like a travel log called Bicycle Diaries, where he's traveling and he's biking in different cities and talks about like how he experiences those cities. And that's a really great thing. And then there's another book written by a Berkeley architecture professor called A Timeless Way of Being. So this is Christopher Alexander, who's famous for this book called A Pattern Language. And The Timeless Way of Being, I think, is a better version of his philosophy. So it's worth checking out.
Wonderful. Thank you for these great resources and for the conversation today. You've been listening or watching the AIGA Design Podcast. I'm Lishan Huang with Julia Donatello. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having us, Julia and Lishan.